Have you ever spent years building something worth more than $1 billion, only to be treated like you were the problem? I spent 4 years helping build Harbor Point, a project worth $1.4 billion. Then, just 6 days before I was supposed to receive an $8 million completion bonus, my CEO decided I was suddenly no longer necessary. He thought he was getting rid of an expensive employee. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. This is what happened to me. The first time Richard Voss asked me how much Harbor Point was going to cost, I knew he wasn't really asking about the project. He was asking what he could cut. We were standing on the unfinished waterfront site in Manhattan, looking at the steel skeleton of what would eventually become a $1.4 billion mixed-use development. 4 years of planning had gone into Harbor Point. 4 years of zoning negotiations, environmental reviews, financing discussions, contractor meetings, tenant negotiations, and enough revised schedules to fill an entire conference room. I had been there for almost all of it. My name was never on the building. But if you wanted to know why the project was still alive, you usually ended up at my desk. I was Nathan Callahan, Senior Director of Development Strategy at Blackstone Meridian Development. My job was to make sure the things executives promised could actually happen in the real world. Architects could design beautiful buildings. Finance could make beautiful spreadsheets. Executives could make beautiful promises. My job was figuring out whether all three could survive contact with reality. That meant I was usually the person asking uncomfortable questions. What happens if the city delays this approval? What happens if the contractor misses this sequence? What happens if financing depends on a permit that isn't final yet? What happens if the environmental review takes longer than expected? People sometimes thought I was pessimistic. I wasn't. I just knew that billion-dollar projects rarely collapsed because of one giant mistake. They collapsed because 5 small problems nobody wanted to discuss suddenly happened at the same time. That's why, whenever someone told me, "We are good," I usually asked the same thing. What are we assuming? Richard hated that question. At first, though, he didn't show it. He was the CEO of Blackstone Meridian, and he had built his reputation on taking complicated developments and making them profitable. He was charismatic, confident, and extremely good at making people feel like they were already on his side. When he walked through Harbor Point, everyone noticed him. When I walked through Harbor Point, people stopped me to ask questions. That difference mattered more than I realized. Richard had authority. I had trust. And he was beginning to resent that. One morning, we stood inside the future lobby while construction crews worked around us. Richard looked at the plans in his hands. How much longer? Until what? Completion. If everything goes according to schedule. Yes. June 30th. He checked his watch. That's close. It is. He looked toward the construction site. And how much more are we spending? I gave him the number. He frowned. Why? Because we are still waiting on environmental clearance for one section, and the city requested additional documentation. Additional documentation. Yes. Was that necessary? I looked at him. If you mean legally necessary, yes. He smiled. You always have an answer. That's usually why people call me. He laughed. But it wasn't really a laugh. It was the kind of laugh people use when they want to remind you that they're the person in charge. I didn't think much of it. At the time, I was more interested in something else. June 30th wasn't just the projected completion milestone. It was the date tied to my compensation agreement. 9 years earlier, when I joined Blackstone Meridian, my executive package included a project completion provision for certain major developments. For Harbor Point, that provision was worth $8 million. It wasn't a discretionary bonus. It wasn't something Richard could simply decide to give me. It was contractual compensation tied to a defined project milestone. And after 4 years of work, June 30th was finally approaching. I didn't spend my days thinking about the money. Honestly, I thought more about the building. Harbor Point had become a strange part of my identity. I knew which approvals were still pending. I knew which contractors were nervous. I knew which financing conditions could create trouble. I knew which people at City Hall returned emails quickly and which ones required 3 follow-ups. And I knew exactly which decisions we absolutely could not rush. Then Richard started talking about efficiency. He called it a strategic transformation. The board called it margin improvement. Richard called it project acceleration. The idea was simple. Reduce unnecessary expenses. Compress timelines. Centralize decision-making. Eliminate redundant reviews. On a presentation slide, it looked brilliant. In reality, some of those redundant steps existed because the consequences of getting them wrong were enormous. I told Richard that. He listened. Then he said, "Nate, you're too close to the project." I didn't argue. Maybe I was. But being close to a project was exactly why I knew where it could break. A few weeks later, Richard presented a revised Harbour Point strategy to the board. I sat near the end of the table. As he moved through the presentation, I recognized several recommendations immediately. They were mine. Not similar. Mine. A sequencing strategy I'd developed. A contractor restructuring I'd proposed. A way of reorganizing the approval process that I'd spent weeks working on with the development team. Richard presented all of it as part of his new strategy. My name never came up. After the meeting, I caught him near the elevator. "You used my proposal." He looked at me. "I used a good idea." "You presented it as your strategy." He smiled. "Nate, the board doesn't need to know who wrote every page." The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. Then he looked back at me. "Besides, we are all working for the same company." The doors closed. I stood there for a moment. Then I went back to work. I wish I could say that was the moment I understood what Richard was doing. It wasn't. I still believed that if I kept doing my job, the politics would eventually become irrelevant. That belief lasted until Diana Mercer called me into her office. Diana was our CFO. She didn't waste words. She slid a document across the desk. "Your Harbour Point compensation." I looked at it. "Okay. When does it vest?" "June 30th. "And how much?" I already knew where this was going. $8 million. She nodded. "That's a significant number." "It is." She looked at me for a few seconds. "Do you know whether the company has discretion over it?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes." I pushed the document back toward her. "It's contractual." She smiled faintly. "I know." I didn't think much of the conversation until I walked out. 3 days later, Richard called me into his office. He had the Harbour Point timeline on his screen. "You've been asking for additional review time. Because the review isn't finished. We are 6 days away. Which is why we shouldn't rush it." He turned toward me. "Do you know how much the company stands to gain if we hit the milestone?" "Yes." "And how much it stands to lose if we don't?" "Yes." He leaned back. "You understand the pressure I'm under." "I understand the project." His expression changed. Just slightly. Then he said, "You know, Nate, sometimes protecting a project and protecting yourself can look very similar." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means perception matters." I didn't answer. Because for the first time, I realized something had changed. This wasn't about Harbour Point anymore. Richard wasn't asking whether my decisions were right. He was asking whether people could be convinced that I had a reason to make them. And somewhere inside Blackstone Meridian, while I was still trying to finish a $1.4 billion project the right way, 2 people had already started calculating something else. Not how to finish Harbour Point. Not how to protect the company, but how to make sure I wasn't there when the clock reached June 30th. I didn't know exactly what Richard and Diana were planning. But I knew enough to start paying attention. Meetings I had attended for years suddenly happened without me. Project updates that normally came directly to my office were routed through Richard. Then HR began asking strangely specific questions. Had I missed any deadlines? Had I ever refused a direct instruction? Were there documented disagreements between me and senior leadership? Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it looked like someone was building a file. Then Michael Reyes called me. Michael was Harbour Point's project manager. We'd worked together for nearly 3 years, and he wasn't someone who panicked easily. "Did you know Richard asked me for every schedule change you've requested since January?" I stopped typing. "No." "He also wanted every approval you've delayed." "I haven't delayed approvals." "I know." "Then what did you give him?" "The records." I leaned back. And what do the records say? That every delay had a documented reason. Good. Michael lowered his voice. Nate, what's going on? I look through the glass wall of my office toward Richard's floor. I think they're trying to make caution look like incompetence. And once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. Richard began mentioning my compensation in meetings where it had no reason to come up. When I raised concerns about Harbour Point's timeline, he called them conflicted recommendations. When I requested another environmental review, he questioned whether I had a financial interest in keeping control of the project until June 30th. Then he started taking my authority away, not enough to officially change my title. Just enough to make every decision harder. Contractor approvals went through him. Budget decisions went through Diana. Project communications increasingly bypassed me. Then, if something slowed down, Richard asked why I wasn't managing it effectively. It was elegant. Create the obstacle. Remove my ability to solve it. Then document the delay. I finally walked into his office and closed the door. You're building a case against me. Richard barely looked up. I'm documenting performance. My performance has been documented for 9 years. Then you shouldn't be worried. You've removed authority from my position and you're blaming me for decisions I no longer control. He leaned back. That's your interpretation. No. That's the timeline. His smile disappeared. I continued. If you want me gone, Richard, say it. He stood. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he walked around his desk. You know what your problem is, Nate. I assume you're going to tell me. You think Harbour Point belongs to you. No. I think we are responsible for delivering what we promised. There. That. What? That tone. Like you're the only adult in the room. I stared at him. Richard stepped closer. This company existed before you. It'll exist after you. And Harbour Point will be finished whether you're standing there to take credit for it or not. That told me everything I needed to know. But Richard still needed something. A reason. He got his opportunity 4 days later. The environmental team sent me a review package for final sign-off. One section was incomplete. Not dramatically incomplete. No smoking gun. No catastrophe waiting on the page. Just a required assessment that hadn't been finalized. Signing it would probably have saved us several days. It also would have meant certifying something I couldn't verify. I emailed Richard. I cannot recommend final submission until the outstanding review is completed. His response came almost immediately. Come upstairs. Diana was already in his office when I arrived. Richard pointed at a chair. I remained standing. He held up my email. You're refusing approval. I'm refusing to certify an incomplete package. The consultants say the remaining review is procedural. Then they can finish it. We could lose the June deadline. Then we lose the deadline. Diana finally spoke. That's an $8 million answer coming from the person receiving $8 million. I looked at her. My compensation has nothing to do with this. Richard laughed. Of course it does. No, it doesn't. You're insisting on a process that keeps you attached to Harbour Point through the milestone. I'm insisting we submit accurate documentation. Richard pushed the package across the desk. Sign it. I didn't touch it. No. His expression hardened. I'm giving you a direct instruction. And I'm giving you my professional judgment. Sign the approval. I won't. The room went silent. Then Richard slowly pulled the document back. Fine. That single word worried me more than if he'd yelled. That afternoon, I wrote everything down. The missing review. The request to accelerate submission. My refusal. The reasons. The potential impact on city approval and financing. I sent the formal warning to Richard, Diana, legal, and the Harbour Point project file. There would be no ambiguity about what I had recommended. 3 days later, my calendar changed. Executive meeting, 9 a.m. No agenda. I checked the date. June 24th. 6 days before the milestone. And suddenly, I understood the entire plan. At 9, I walked into a conference room and found Richard, Diana, an HR representative, Elena Park from legal, and one member of the board's compensation committee. A folder was waiting at my seat. I didn't open it. Richard folded his hands. Nate, we've completed a review of the development organization. I almost admired the wording. And we've decided to restructure your position. 6 days before Harbour Point's milestone. Diana looked down. Richard didn't. The timing isn't relevant. I looked at him. We both knew that was a lie. He continued. Effective today, your position is being eliminated. Am I being terminated for cause? Elena glanced at Richard. He answered. No. This is a restructuring decision. That mattered. I knew it. Elena knew it. I'm not sure Richard understood how much it mattered. I finally opened the folder. Termination documents. Benefits information. Confidentiality reminders. 9 years reduced to paper. Richard watched me read. Then he gave himself one last victory. Harbour Point will be finished without you. I closed the folder. I hope it is. He frowned. Why? Because it's worth $1.4 billion. I stood. Richard looked almost disappointed that I wasn't angry. Maybe he wanted me to argue. Maybe he wanted me to threaten him. Instead, I handed over my access card. Anything else? No. Then we are done. I walked out. For 9 years, I had entered that building believing responsibility meant staying until the problem was solved. That morning, for the first time, I left one behind. At home, I knew something was wrong before I said anything. They fired you. I nodded. When? This morning. She stared at me. Then she remembered. June 30th. 6 days. The bonus. $8 million. She sat beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said the part that actually hurt. They're going to take 4 years of my work, finish the project, and tell everyone I was the one slowing it down. Maya looked at me. They can remove your name from the presentation. I said nothing. They can't remove what you did. That night, I opened my laptop. Not to contact the board. Not to call investors. Not to threaten Richard. I created one folder. Harbour Point. Record. I organized copies of everything I was legally entitled to retain. My compensation documents. Signed agreements. Formal warnings. Performance records. The history of the project decisions that had led to June 24th. Then I opened the agreement I'd signed years earlier. Project Continuity Agreement. I had remembered the protection existed. I hadn't remembered exactly how broad it was. I read it once. Then again. Termination without cause within the protected completion window. Material removal from project authority. Company action preventing completion of the defined milestone. Accelerated payment of contracted project compensation. I stared at the screen. $8 million. Richard thought he'd fired me 6 days early enough to make it disappear. Instead, by terminating me without cause inside the protected window, he had done exactly what the agreement was designed to prevent. He hadn't saved the company $8 million. He had guaranteed it. And the strangest part was that I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Because I knew Harbour Point. I knew the unfinished review sitting inside that project. And now the people who had spent weeks telling everyone they didn't need me were about to find out whether they were right. The first call came at 7:12 the next morning. It was Michael. I almost didn't answer. Then I saw his name again. I picked up. Nate. Yeah. He sounded exhausted. We have a problem. I looked out the window. What happened? The city put the Harbour Point submission on hold. I closed my eyes. Why? The environmental package. I already knew. The review wasn't complete. I know. Who submitted it? Silence. Then Michael said, Richard's office. Of course it was. They had taken the exact risk I had warned them about. Now the consequences belonged to them. Over the next 3 days, the problems multiplied. The city requested additional documentation. The financing partner froze one scheduled draw until the approval issue was clarified. The anchor tenant asked whether the June timeline was still realistic, and suddenly, the project Richard had described as fully under control was facing questions from everyone who mattered. But I stayed out of it. I didn't call Michael with instructions. I didn't contact the city. I didn't call the financing partner. I didn't send Richard a message saying, "I told you so." I had been removed from the project. So I let the people who had removed me manage it. Then, on Friday afternoon, Diana called. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she didn't bother with small talk. "Did you know the agreement would trigger?" "Yes." "How long?" "Since the day I read it." She went silent. "You knew before you were terminated." "I knew the protection existed. I didn't know you were going to terminate me." "But you knew." "I knew my contract." Her voice became quieter. "Why didn't you tell us?" I almost laughed. "You spent 2 weeks building a case to prove I wasn't necessary." "That isn't what I asked." "No. You asked why I didn't stop you from making your own decision." She didn't respond. I continued. "You had legal. You had finance. You had the agreement. We thought the provision only applied if." "You thought." That was the problem. They had assumed. They had calculated. They had timed my termination down to the day. And they had never stopped to ask what the document actually said. Diana finally said, "You're going to enforce it?" "Yes." 8 million. "Yes." That could become a serious issue for the company. I looked out the window. "You should have thought about that before you fired me." She hung up. The following Monday, Elena Park from legal contacted me formally. She asked me to attend a board meeting. I agreed. When I arrived, the room felt different from the one where I had been fired. There was no HR representative. No termination folder. No rehearsed explanation. Instead, there were board members, legal counsel, Diana, Richard, and a stack of documents in the center of the table. Richard wouldn't look at me. Elena began. "We've reviewed the project continuity agreement." I said nothing. She continued. "The company acknowledges that your termination occurred within the protected completion window." I nodded. "And that the termination materially removed you from your contracted project responsibilities." Another nod. "The compensation obligation has therefore been triggered." Richard finally looked at me. "This is absurd." Elena turned toward him. "No. It's contractual." Richard shook his head. "We didn't know." Elena's expression didn't change. "You signed the agreement." He looked at Diana. Diana looked down. Elena opened another folder. "And there is another issue." She placed a timeline on the table. June 24th. June 30th. 6 days. Then she placed Diana's compensation analysis beside it. The room went silent. Elena said, "This analysis was prepared before the termination." Richard didn't answer. "You calculated the financial benefit of terminating Mr. Callahan before the milestone." Richard leaned back. "We were evaluating compensation exposure." "You were evaluating how to avoid it." "We were restructuring the organization." Elena looked directly at him. "Then why was the termination date specifically selected 6 days before the milestone?" Richard had no answer. I didn't either. I didn't need one. The documents were answering for him. Then Elena placed my written warning on the table. The one about the environmental review. Then the approval request. Then Richard's instruction to accelerate the submission. Then my refusal. One by one, the story changed. I hadn't delayed Harbor Point. I had warned them. I hadn't obstructed the project. I had refused to certify incomplete documentation. I hadn't created the risk. I had documented it. And the same people who had described me as an obstacle had removed the person who understood how all those pieces fit together. Elena finally turned toward the board. The company is currently exposed to the $8 million contractual payment, plus costs associated with the resulting delay. Diana added quietly, "The financing exposure could be significantly higher if the delay continues." Richard looked at me. "You knew all of this was going to happen." I shook my head. "No. You knew the project would have problems. I knew there were risks. You could have helped." I looked at him. "You fired me. You could have warned us." "I did." He stared at me. "The warnings are in front of you." Silence. Then Richard said something I don't think he realized would destroy what was left of his argument. You could have told us about the agreement. I answered calmly. You didn't ask. He looked furious. But there was nothing left to say. Because that was the entire story. They didn't lose $8 million because I tricked them. They lost it because they wanted to save it. The board approved the payment. $8 million. No negotiation. No settlement designed to make me feel grateful. No favor. Just the amount the company had already agreed to pay. I signed the necessary documents and stood up. Richard remained seated. As I reached the door, he finally spoke. You're really just going to walk away? I turned. Yes. After everything. I looked at him for a moment. You told me Harbor Point would be finished without me. He didn't respond. I hope you're right. Then I left. Richard eventually lost his executive authority. Diana stayed, but the board placed her under review during the restructuring. Harbor Point continued, but the company spent millions addressing risks I had warned about months earlier. And I didn't go back. 3 months later, I accepted a position as managing director of development strategy at another firm. Better compensation. More authority. A team of my own. And, ironically, one of the first things my new employer asked me was, what do you need to make sure this project doesn't fail? I almost smiled. For years, I had been punished for answering that question honestly. Now someone was paying me to do exactly that. One afternoon, I stood in front of a model for our newest development. A junior manager pointed at one section. What happens if that assumption is wrong? I looked at her. And I smiled. Good question. She waited. I said, what do you think our backup is? She started explaining. I listened, and for the first time, I understood something I hadn't understood during all those years at Blackstone Meridian. I had spent so much time trying to become indispensable that I had forgotten something important. Being indispensable isn't the same as being valuable. A good leader doesn't build a system that collapses when he leaves. He builds one that keeps working without him. Blackstone Meridian had spent years depending on me. Then Richard decided dependence was weakness. So he fired me. He thought he was saving the company $8 million. Instead, he guaranteed every dollar of it. And the funniest part? I never sabotaged Harbor Point. I never leaked a document. I never called an investor. I never touched a single decision after they fired me. I simply stopped protecting people who had deliberately decided they didn't need my protection. They made the decision. They signed the agreement. They chose the date. And when the consequences finally arrived, they had nobody left to blame but themselves.